In Canada's government, there's 5 different aspects to the government. The first one is the Constitution, the monarch, and then the 3 different branches of the government. First of all, I'm going to be talking about the Constitution and the monarch, since they are the first on my list. The Constitution is a pretty simple concept. It's the supreme law of Canada, and it outlines the government and the civil rights and human rights of people who are citizens in Canada and just people who are in Canada that aren't citizens. The Constitution also includes the Charter of Rights of Freedom. The Constitution also makes the rules that creates our political and legal systems, and this is what makes diversity within it. This allows for different roles and powers to be present in our government. With that, that's basically the Constitution, so now I'm going to move on to the monarch. The monarch is pretty much just the king or queen, and the current king is King Charles, but in Canada he is represented by the Governor General, who is actively Mary Simons. The Governor General can sign bills and approve of them just as the king might do for us, but she does his job in Canada, so he doesn't have to. Now that that's over with, I'm going to start explaining the 3 different branches of the government, starting with the legislative branch. The legislative branch pretty much can just pass or suggest laws for Canada. These laws are called bills. The legislative branch includes the Senate and the House of Commons, and the House of Commons is pretty much just commoners that get elected by Canadian voters, and these people are called members of parliament or MPs. MPs are members of parliament, basically just debate and pass laws, and they communicate between constituents and the government, and they approve or don't approve of the government's budget. Moving on to the Senate usually contains people who are called senators. Senators remain in office until they're 75, and they represent the rights and interests of Canadians' regions, especially the minorities. They can also propose laws that are usually bills, and they can give second thoughts and careful consideration to all laws that already exist. That's pretty much everything in the legislative branch, so now I'm going to start talking about the judicial branch. With the judicial branch, the main thing that's within it is the Supreme Court of Canada, which is the highest court, and down to the lowest court, it's called the provincial and territorial courts. Starting with the Supreme Court of Canada, once again, is the highest court in Canada, and the people involved are judges who were appointed by the Prime Minister and Cabinet. Usually the people in the Supreme Court of Canada must be a lawyer for at least 10 years before they can do that, and they can overturn laws and have the final word on legal questions in the country as well. Moving on from the Supreme Court of Canada, we have the provincial and territorial courts, which are the lowest courts within Canada, and they usually deal with most cases, including criminal cases and family issues. And some examples of these cases are cases such as someone robs a store and then they have to go to trial to either plead guilty or not guilty. And yeah, usually this just deals with all the low cases that aren't worth the Supreme Court's time. Judges who serve in these courts are paid and appointed by the provinces and territories, and they follow and report to the law and use it fairly for each case. Moving on from the judicial branch, we have the executive branch. The executive branch just pretty much runs day-to-day business of the government and other things like the RCMP or government-funded things like schools and making sure everyone has free healthcare and education and stuff like that. The 3 main things that are included in the executive branch are the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, and the government departments. The Prime Minister is the head or leader of Canada, and they're also the leader of the majority party in the House of Commons, which means they've become the leader of a party and they were voted to be the majority in Canada. The Prime Minister is the most powerful part in the government, and they are responsible for all of the government's policies and decisions. They also represent the face of their party, and they're supposed to work for the interests of the people, but they also work for their party, and they're just the face of their party expressing their interests. Our current Prime Minister is Justin Trudeau, and he comes from Ontario. Moving on from the Prime Minister, we have the Cabinet, which is actually appointed by the Prime Minister. The Cabinet is made up of approximately 30 members since it fluctuates, and the ministers are also what they're called. And they're all appointed individually by the Prime Minister and occasionally the Senate. What the cabinet does is they basically just advise the prime minister on issues that are a majority of different policies and issues. And moving on from the cabinet, we have the government departments, which is the last thing here. And examples of government departments are just jobs that are funded by the government or run by the government. And some examples of these are like firefighters, policemen, doctors, teachers, etc. And once again, just to recap, since that's everything, there's the Constitution, monarch, and then the three branches, and then that's pretty much the main parts of the government, and that's all.